Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Eliza Lawdley with Panther Creek Farm. It's great to have you all joining us this year. Thank you so much for being part of this session. Thank you for the Carolina Farm Stewardship Association for putting this on, and for Earth Tools, our amazing sponsor for this session. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started. All right, y'all, welcome again. So my name is Eliza, and we're going to be exploring keyline design today. So I'm going to speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then I would love to provide my contact information to folks after the session. I'll have a slide up at the very end. If you want to continue the conversation, I would love to continue talking since this is not a live session. So please feel free to reach out to me after this conference if you'd like to continue learning more about keyline design, or maybe you're a farmer practicing keyline design. I would love to connect. So this image is of Panther Creek Forest Farm. We are located in Durham, North Carolina, kind of in the central part of the state. And this is our 7th CFSA conference. So big thank you again to CFSA for hosting. We have learned a ton, both from CFSA, all their supporters, and folks attending the conferences over the years. So I also want to acknowledge that we are on the ancestral homelands of the Shakori, the Eno, the Saponi, the Tuscarora communities, who are the First Nations stewards of Turtle Island and this part of present-day Durham County. So the image that you see here shows part of our farm and then Falls Lake, which is in the top left. Falls Lake is a dammed part of the Neuse River. So we're at the headwaters of the Neuse River, where the Eno River and the Ellerby Creek run into Falls Lake. So if you're familiar with this area, please reach out and we'd love to connect. So the agenda today is I'm going to share a little bit about my interests and how I got interested in keyline design. We're going to talk about what keyline design and agroforestry are in practice, both on small urban scales and on larger rural farms. And then I'm going to give 3 case studies that I've been kind of involved with, both as a farm manager or as the owner of the property itself. So we'll look at small scale gardens, mid-scale farms, and then larger scale forest properties. And then I want to leave everyone with some tools that I've found very helpful in my practice, both as a farmer and also as a landscape architect, so that hopefully you feel empowered after this, if you're new to keyline design, to get started, or if you're already farming and practicing some of these things, to kind of continue designing out other parts of your farm. So again, big thanks to Earth Tools, who is sponsoring this session. We are a big fan of BCS walking tractors and hand tools that we buy from Earth Tools, and they've been supporting this conference for many years. So a little bit about myself, if you guys would indulge me for a moment. I want to give just a little introduction to how I got into this topic. It is a little bit niche, and I really enjoy connecting with folks who are also passionate about keyline. So I started farming back in 2012, so I still definitely consider myself a new and beginning farmer. I farm with my wife, Jacqueline, and my mother, Lee and Clay, my mother, Lee, and my father, Clay, and then my 2 brothers. So it's definitely a family operation in Durham. We bought our farm in 2014, but my background is really in fine arts and landscape architecture. So I recently completed my master's at NC State University in the College of Design. So my brain really enjoys kind of the creative side of land stewardship and also putting it into practice through farming and design. So I'm currently working off the farm for another farm, which is the Durham Public School Hub Farm. There's the logo. And I'm going to be representing them hard tonight because I love the work that they do. And I really feel passionately about farming and connecting farming and agriculture to our next generation of students here in Durham. So if you're local and you're interested in supporting a great nonprofit and organization, please reach out to the Durham Public School Hub Farm. So zooming back into Panther Creek, which is our family farm, we have been doing lots of different projects out there that I'll share. And this has been informed by many years for me of working with nonprofit farms and gardens. So that's kind of my angle coming into this work. And some of the organizations that I've worked for and that have influenced my perspective of course, NC State, doing my graduate work there. Most recently, I was the farm manager for the Triangle Land Conservancy. So I'm really excited to talk a little bit about conservation and how Keyline design fits into that. And then I'm also still working closely with Be Downtown and the Interfaith Food Shuttle and others that have helped kind of build my tool set and skills as a farmer. And then our family has kind of branded themselves as a family farm, but we're really focused on agroforestry. For my brother in the top left, that means painting on site. For my other brother, he does photography and land stewardship. So not all of us are farmers, but we all really enjoy being out on the land together as a family. And that's really what brought us into agriculture as first generation farmers. So family farming to us, we like to joke, is forest organizing. We are really focused on agroforestry. So the integration of livestock and crops, mainly woody crops and timber production. But my mom branded this as forest organizing, which I think is very, very accurate. And we'll talk about how Keyline design works throughout these systems. And my graduate work was really focused on disaster planning and resilience in the face of climate change. So I'm trained as a landscape architect with an emphasis on how our farms, especially in North Carolina, are going to adapt to changing climates, more severe weather patterns, and the increase of animal, especially confinement operations on agricultural lands here in North Carolina. So the image that you see here is in eastern North Carolina. As many of you probably know, we have 9.5 million hogs across the state of North Carolina. My wife's entire family is from down east, so this is very much an integrated part of the culture and the livelihoods of those living in the eastern part of the state. And we studied throughout our graduate degree just kind of how these larger farms and industrial operations are going to be impacted as we continue to see the commercialization of livestock farming, as we see poor water management practices, as we see larger storm events and hurricanes that will continue to devastate these farms. So I spent many years looking at these operations and also studying how previous storm events in the state of North Carolina have impacted these operations. So for those of us that grew up in North Carolina, we remember Hurricane Fran and Hurricane Floyd. The image on the left is from eastern North Carolina after Hurricane Floyd in '99. And then the image on the right is just a decade later, Hurricane Florence and Hurricane Matthew devastating those exact same farms. So I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of talking about animal confinement or commercial ag, but those are definitely interest areas of mine. But I am going to focus on talking about keyline design and how that can help mitigate flooding and hazards that we see in agricultural land. When we don't mitigate these issues and we continue to see climate change disrupting our ecosystems, we have what we see here on the screen, which is devastation to our coastal communities, devastation to our farmers and to our ecosystems. So the image that you see here is hog waste, nitrogen runoff, topsoil runoff, and pollution running out to the North Carolina coast along the Outer Banks. This is just a section of our coast, but this was directly following Hurricane Florence, which really impacted a lot of our family, and I'm sure for many of us impacted our farms. So for me, I farm and live in Durham, North Carolina. We are in the central part of the state. Sea level rise and riverine flooding are not a huge threat to our farm, but we do see it as our responsibility as farmers to properly design our farms and gardens to mitigate runoff, even if that runoff is organic compost or animal waste. We really do not need more nitrogen kind of flowing into our water bodies, because what ends up happening is it runs downstream, as we all know, and enters into our coastal habitats in our low-lying areas around the North Carolina Outer Banks and other areas. So this is just one example. I know I'm preaching to the choir for many of us. This is something we think about and talk about all the time, but this is really my training is understanding disaster planning and resilience. So what is keyline design and how does that fit into this grander problem that we have facing our farms over the next coming decades? So keyline design, I like to think of as a very big kind of catch-all phrase. You'll hear keylining as a term. You'll hear keyline plows as a term. You will hear people talk about keyline berms and swales. So it's a very loose term. I'm going to give us a definition to work with for the sake of this presentation. But really this talk is about case studies that I've kind of worked with to practice keyline design on farms. So pulling this quote from an awesome organization called Hatchet and Seed. I've left their research study and their website here at the bottom, but they define keyline design to be water management that is consciously slowing, sinking, and spreading rainwater across a landscape, which is helping by relieving compaction, opening up pore space and compacted soil, and distributing excess water towards drier parts of the landscape. This has the effect of buffering the natural concentration of water towards valleys and reducing flooding. So I know that's a lot. I'm going to show a lot of pretty pictures to kind of help illustrate this definition. But the simple idea is that our valleys on our farms, whatever low-lying areas we have, naturally are going to be wet, and the ridge points on our farm are naturally going to be more dry. So keyline design is really working towards moving water from the wet points of our farm, so our valleys, out to the ridge line. So if we think about contour farming, that is holding water directly on contour. And keyline design is slowly moving water from the valleys to the ridges by pulling water to those areas at a less than 2% slope. So I'm not going to get too technical on the grading side of it, but I'm going to show a lot of images to kind of bring this full circle. So again, there are some definitions here that can be confusing. Some people talk about keyline plowing, which is the image on the left. Keyline plowing is both a physical implement that you can pull behind a tractor. Some people call it a yeoman's plow. It's basically a really amazing subsoiler that helps to rip soil instead of turning it over. Many of us have probably used these on farm in different capacities, but keyline plowing is an amazing tool to help open up compacted soils and basically act like a giant broad fork that you pull behind a tractor. What we're talking about today is going to be keyline berms and swales, which is the image on the right. So as you can see with my cursor, we've got a swale, which is a depression, and then a berm, which is an elevated mound of soil. So when these berms and swales are interlocked or connected across a landscape, that's what we're calling keyline design. So we're designing an entire landscape to have these interlocking series of berms and swales. So keyline plowing and keyline berms and swales are both amazing tools. They can be used together. Often they are. But today we're really going to be talking about the berms and swales, which are going to be off contour instead of the plowing. So if folks have questions about plowing, I'd be happy to email and talk about that. So an example here is on a farm here in central North Carolina. And I had the opportunity over the last 5 years to work very closely with Mark Shepard, who's on the left-hand side of the screen of New Forest Farm. So Mark Shepard really kind of took the work of a farmer from Australia, P.A. Yeoman, and carried that work forward to the United States and kind of branded keyline design as the American keyline system. So P.A. Yeoman kind of developed keyline design in Australia in the 1950s, and Mark Shepard has kind of brought it to North Carolina and also to other farmers in the United States with kind of some twists and unique elements to his work. So Mark and I met back in 2015, actually here at the CFSA conference, which is really exciting. And he was the keynote speaker. I ended up reading his book, Restoration Agriculture, got totally hooked on agroforestry, which we'll talk about in a moment. And he kind of introduced me to the idea of keyline design. Since then, I've gone to graduate school to study it and really practiced it on a number of different farms, and can say without a doubt that it's an incredible tool, an amazing kind of approach to landscape. So the image that you see here, and I've added these arrows obviously to show water movement, but Mark is designing the farm that you see here in this image. So these swales and berms are meant to catch water that are moving across this pasture, keep them kind of high in the landscape, keeping those berms and swales high in the landscape, and then allowing water to slowly sink in and infiltrate. So another example of this was at the Triangle Land Conservancy, and I'll talk more about this project in a moment, where I got to work with Mark Shepard's team, our staff at the Triangle Land Conservancy, and an awesome local organization called Leaf and Limb to implement a 17-acre keyline design system. So again, you see the blue arrows in the bottom right. Water would be moving downhill across this pasture, but instead we've kind of done a one-time pass with the bulldozer to kind of build up these swales and berms. I've heard other farmers describe keyline design as chiropractics for the land, meaning that if things are out of alignment, we're going to continue to see runoff. We might, in certain situations, see flooding. And really, to bring in a bulldozer for this heavy kind of earthwork process is equivalent to doing chiropractics on a piece of farmland. So we're kind of cracking things back into place. We're bringing these swales and berms into the landscape to kind of implement this, again, slow sink spread method of water management. So if you're a little bit lost at the moment or you have questions, we're going to kind of show a number of different examples, both on an urban scale and a rural scale. I do want to just mention, though, that I've brought this keyline design approach into many urban settings. So if you're an urban farmer, a backyard gardener, a homesteader, I still think this is a really appropriate use of tools, resources, and design. So this project that you see here was a design that I did with two other folks in downtown Raleigh, where we designed a 5-acre urban parcel. So I'm not going to go into too many details here, but just to say that you start seeing these patterns throughout different farmlands. So if you're noticing these bands of trees or these little bioswales and catchment areas in the north end of the site, that is being informed by keyline design on a very tight urban lot. So it doesn't have to be a huge farm. It can really fit at any scale. Another example is a site that I helped design at NC State University. This was a 3.5-acre site, again, that has a stage. It has big pavilions for events. We had to design in food truck rodeo areas, an ADA accessible pathway for folks to enjoy the site, but we were able to integrate keyline design throughout this whole system, make it functional, make it beautiful, make it accessible to student life and campus life. So it really can fit at like the most formal kind of landscape architecture scales or at the farm or garden scale. And just to drive this point home, I think rural farmers have certain tools that urban farmers do not have, and vice versa, mainly being space to kind of integrate this. But on the left is our farm, Panther Creek, with a view of one of our keyline design systems. And then the image on the right is a garden that I helped design with the Interfaith Food Shuttle that also brought in some keyline design systems. So it can be anything from pastures to produce to woody crops to any kind of thing that you can imagine. Keyline design is really meant to just be the water management system that kind of is the basis for everything else to build on top of. So I'm going to talk really quickly about agroforestry because that is kind of the layer that comes on top of keyline design. And then we're going to talk about these case studies. So what is agroforestry? I'm going to reference Mark Shepard again here. And the USDA kind of provides a handy quote for us. But agroforestry is the intentional combination of agriculture and forestry. So they literally took those two words and smushed them together. These practices take advantage of interactive benefits from growing trees and shrubs together with crops and livestock. So this is a practice that I've been really interested in for many years, but I just want to mention the most important thread throughout all of this is that agroforestry is an indigenous practice both to Turtle Island and other parts of the world. I think often Mark Shepard and others get all the credit for bringing agroforestry here to North America, and that's simply not true. I think each farmer kind of brings their own flavor to keyline design and to agroforestry. They take their own spin. They do certain cool, combinations of crops and water management, but it's an indigenous and ancient practice that we see throughout the world. So some of the most vibrant and incredible models of keyline design and agroforestry together are indigenous communities in Mexico throughout the Yucatan. So I just want to bring that forward and mention that. Mark Shepard has kind of made it a buzzword here in the United States, and he is definitely an amazing practitioner that's taught me a lot. So the image on the left is New Forest Farm, which is Mark Shepard's property in Viola, Wisconsin. This property is or a lot of people will say this is one of the largest agroforestry farms in the world. It's certainly one of the largest in the United States. But as you see, agroforestry, again, is integrating different crops with livestock, shrubs, and trees. So these bands that you kind of see across this image on the left is agroforestry in practice. Now, what you can't see as easily is that keyline design is kind of permeated throughout this entire system. So there is water catchment systems, both with berms and swales, and also with the keyline plow that kind of is the underpinning to all of these different systems. So agroforestry and keyline design definitely go together really beautifully. You don't have to do agroforestry with keyline design, but it is a very effective perennial system to kind of work within that water management. So briefly, I want to talk about kind of different styles of agroforestry. These infographics, there's 5 of them that I'll share, are from the Savannah Institute. If you're interested in agroforestry, the Savannah Institute is doing really, really cool work, kind of in the middle part of the country in the Midwest. But alley cropping is one of the most familiar practices within agroforestry. So this is the cultivation of crops in the alleys between regularly spaced rows of trees or shrubs. So for example, if you're a farmer growing commodity crops, or maybe you're growing large scale annual crops and you want to move into agroforestry, keyline design would kind of give you that water management pattern. And then alley cropping would allow you to grow crops between those series of berms and swales. So on our farm, the spacing, just to give you a reference, is 50 feet between these rows of trees and shrubs. But then we're able to grow things in the alleys of these systems. The second practice, as defined by the USDA for agroforestry, is the cultivation of specialty crops under existing forest canopies. So this is what we call forest farming. It's a huge practice because it kind of encompasses many different things. For those of us interested in woody crops, we're thinking about growing trees for animal fodder. We're thinking about growing woody species for mushroom production, for mulching, all different practices that can kind of be integrated into a more shady environment in the understory of existing canopy. So one of the most famous forest farm crops with keyline design is coffee. So coffee is grown throughout the tropics and can work really, really well, both as an understory planting, but with keyline design. The third practice within agroforestry is riparian buffers. Again, this is a great time and place within these buffers to build in keyline patterns. But these are strips of permanent vegetation alongside a stream, a lake, or a wetland. So at our farm, Panther Creek, we back up to Panther Creek and also to Falls Lake. And so we really see it as important to have many different riparian buffers before we hit the water's edge. Thankfully, in Durham County, the Army Corps of Engineers maintains a buffer along the lake. But many, many farms do not have that luxury of having kind of resources at the ready to maintain and plant these buffers. So if we can make them productive parts of our farms through agroforestry, then we can start bringing in yields and some income from these riparian buffers. The fourth practice of agroforestry is very common to many of us at this point, but it's the practice of silvopasture, which is the integration of trees, pasture, and livestock, which is managed as a single system. So again, if we're thinking about keyline design and these series of berms and swales, we've kind of set up a pattern in which we can plant trees and shrubs and move livestock efficiently through those systems. A lot of the research being done in North Carolina is through NC State. So it's a really fun place for me to go to school and kind of tap into that. But the Center for Environmental Farming Systems is an amazing resource for silvopasture, especially if you're interested in cattle production or poultry. And then our final practice in agroforestry are windbreaks. Many of us are probably already working with windbreaks on our farm, whether they were there before we inherited or purchased the land, or whether they were planted. Windbreaks are strips of trees and shrubs designed to enhance crop or livestock production while providing conservation benefits. So again, if we're thinking about keyline design and these berms and swales, there's no reason that we can't have windbreaks planted, for example, along those berms in between our different production spaces. So we're going to talk for a minute about 3 different case studies, and then I'm going to end the presentation with talking about tools of kind of implementing keyline design. So just to review, we've kind of talked about what keyline design is, kind of in a more technical way with grading. We've talked about agroforestry, which is kind of the overlay or the second layer on top of keyline design. And now I want to kind of give you some examples of what that looks like in practice. So on a smaller scale, thinking about gardens, I think this is a really untapped area for us to incorporate keyline design. Again, I work for the Durham Public Schools Hub Farm, and so oftentimes we're looking at much smaller spaces. We're thinking about something under 30 acres, for example, or sometimes under an acre that might be a school garden or a campus farm, or a parent and teacher's backyard or something of that nature. So keyline design is really critical kind of at this smaller scale. And if you guys don't mind, I'm going to start with one of my favorite gardens here in the area. I'm a little bit biased. This is a garden that I helped to start with a number of folks through the Interfaith Food Shuttle in East Durham in 2017. So this is the Gear Street Learning Garden. Again, located in kind of downtown Durham off of Mangum and Gear Street. And this is a 1 acre urban parcel. So the aerial view that you see here shows some beehives, some fruit trees, a number of raised beds, and then production space for a greenhouse, a duck coop, and outdoor classroom space for field trips with students. So a lot happening on this small scale. The produce that was grown in this garden and the fruit that was grown in this garden is still to this day being donated to local pantries and to visitors who help maintain this space. So when I first started, this was an abandoned lot. We call it urban soil in landscape architecture. When you get a soil sample that's just like completely off the charts, it might have lead, it might have rubble, it might have arsenic. Urban soils are kind of a large classification of soils that basically just means they've been highly disturbed. There's debris, and there's just a lot of problems with compaction. So for those that have worked on urban farms, this is nothing new. But the image that you see here was in our first year when we started building beds, bringing in compost, starting to mulch heavily. But with every single rain, we were just not seeing any infiltration. Water was just sitting on the soil surface, breeding mosquitoes, just making it really difficult to work in the space. Even with kind of deep litter or mulching with wood chips and cardboard and doing all the lasagna mulching that you can imagine, water was still just not percolating through that top layer of soil. So again, this is a great opportunity for keyline design. As you see here, the beds are built exactly on contour. And over the years, we had to implement keyline design to move those beds from being on contour to slightly off contour. Because again, our goal is not to hold water in every single bed, but to move water from low wet spots to higher drier spots. So if that doesn't make sense, I'm going to give you a quick couple images to kind of illustrate that point. So this is an example in that first year of volunteers busting up the soil, and you can see behind the gentleman in the black that the water table is just right there at the soil surface. So we had chunks of concrete in this soil. We had all kinds of kind of construction type grade subsoil that had been brought onto the site. And so keyline design was critical. and trying to get water to move from these wet areas and into the more dry areas of the garden. So we started with this group of volunteers. Thankfully, the Interfaith Food Shuttle engages hundreds of volunteers a month. So we had resources as far as people power, but we were using hand tools. So this was an example of no machinery, just hand tools, shovels, pickaxes. I think we borrowed a tiller at one point, but otherwise was just hand tools. So you can see this was kind of a week into the process. This was midsummer, starting to address the fact that we wanted water to move from the right-hand side of this image, which stayed super, super wet and soggy, and we wanted it to move across this image to the left. So you can start to see these swales being designed by these two volunteers, and then the berm on the other side did not end up staying that tall. But we did create a berm to kind of direct that water. A few weeks later, we had a giant storm, as we see in North Carolina often. One of my biggest pet peeves, and that I hear all too often, is that we don't see flooding in the central part of North Carolina. We talk a lot about flooding in the western part of the state with flash floods. We talk a lot about flooding in the eastern part of the state with coastal flooding and storm surge events. But we are seeing an increasingly high likelihood and occurrence of flash flooding in the Piedmont. So this is one of those examples of just a deluge, inches and inches of rain in a very short span of time, kind of filling up these berms and swales. So the volunteers that you see here are digging this swale system back. So where they're currently standing, we excavated that material and kind of opened up this swale to hold more water. This is another image of that site. You can start to see behind these volunteers that there's a parking lot. So another important feature of this Keyline system was filtering the water as best we could with plant material and also woven landscape fabric to catch a lot of the debris coming off the parking lot and trying to filter out some of those contaminants. We also installed a rain cistern that you guys can see on the building, again, to kind of capture some of that storm event water and slow it down before it hit the garden. So this was a couple weeks after the event that you just saw. We brought in about 16 cubic yards of sand into this garden. A lot of it was for this particular site that you see in this image. So a rain garden, just to help everyone understand terms, a rain garden is usually a depression that can hold water up to 3 days. And it's slightly different than a Keyline system, which a Keyline system is trying to capture that water and move it to a new location. So some infiltration is happening, but a lot of it is moving out of the system. So the image that you see here is a rain garden, but that we installed two kind of overflow areas on that rain garden to move water into the rest of the space. The other thing that we incorporated to this design were water-loving plants like hibiscus, elderberry, swamp sunflower, all kinds of natives that we really had a fun time with kind of planting along this berm. A lot of these plants could deal with toxins coming off the parking lot and could help absorb some of that runoff. Shortly after that image that you just saw was taken, we brought in a little bit more sand. This was a couple months later as we were starting to realize that we didn't want all of the water soaking into that system as fast as it was. The sand was kind of infiltrating things too quickly, and it wasn't leaving water available for the rest of the garden to kind of move throughout these raised beds. So we got a big donation of a pallet of cardboard boxes from a local brewery. Those that love full steam, this was a full steam brewery donation. And so we layered sand and cardboard kind of alternating in this rain garden area to kind of help move some of the water off of that space and into the garden. This is a great photo that we took shortly after all the cardboard went in. We learned after the big storm event that followed this image that we had put down too much cardboard. Not enough water was infiltrating. And so we kind of removed some of that cardboard until we found a perfect layer of cardboard and sand. So for those that work in urban agriculture, this is not an unfamiliar experience of just kind of scavenging donated materials and kind of working with what you've got. But this was kind of Keyline on a 1 acre scale. So shortly after, we mulched the entire site. We brought the Keyline kind of rain garden up to the level of the soil with the rest of the garden, so that it wasn't a hazard. We kind of leveled that whole area and started kind of bringing in rocks and plants and different things to beautify the space around the edge of that system. So again, if you're in a highly visible urban area, you can't just start trenching and ditching things all over the yard sometimes. If you have an HOA or if you've got different considerations as far as aesthetics, I would encourage you just to take that extra step to landscape and design that space appropriately. But as you can see, the crops behind us were flourishing that summer. We were getting tons of water kind of diverted from these wet areas and moving into different areas of the garden. And this was that following summer. So from summer until fall, this was a fall shot. We really focused on the Keyline system, kind of moving water downhill and moving it across these channels that we dug by hand. So the image that you see here is a cover crop of crimson clover interplanted with garlic. We were not hoping to harvest any of the garlic. It was just meant to kind of break up subsoil. And then we worked in those Keyline berms and swales all the way down the site. So this is just one example of kind of how to vegetate some of these systems, if that's advantageous for you. And then this was the following year, was really making sure that we were bringing in other tools into our Keyline pattern. So we were moving water across the site. We were planting species that we knew could handle a lot of wet soil. So persimmons and pawpaws and elderberries were planted along these berms. And then we got a second donation through a grant with Durham Soil and Water to implement another cistern. So we were realizing that there was just a ton of rain coming off the roof we weren't capturing. So if you're interested in kind of urban scale Keyline design, I'd be happy to talk with folks. This was one of many gardens that we've kind of brought this system into the urban sphere. So now we're going to talk about a second case study, which is a mid-scale example, looking at most kind of farm scale examples of Keyline design. So for the last few years, I've been working with the Triangle Land Conservancy. TLC, as it's known here, purchased a 400-acre farm east of Raleigh, known as the Williamson Preserve. And we got granted an amazing gift from two different donors to implement Keyline design on a 17-acre field within the Williamson Preserve. So this farm example is a huge collaborative effort between donors, the Triangle Land Conservancy, and an amazing group known as Leaf and Limb. So most of the property is either wooded, heavily wooded, or kind of mid-succession open field. So this image shows the Chickasaw Plum Field, which is where this Keyline system took place. This is kind of in the heart of the Williamson Preserve, kind of sits right in the center of the property. Again, it's a 400-acre public nature preserve. So we have hundreds of people from the public kind of walking past this field or through these areas. So the Keyline design project was meant to slow and spread and sink water in this particular pasture. It was also meant to benefit wildlife, to mitigate erosion, to improve water quality, but also to be an educational tool to all of these visitors that came through the site to learn more about this, this method of Keyline design. So the image that you all see here is a graphic that the Triangle Land Conservancy has used for a couple of years now, that was designed by a group called the Regenerative Design Group. They are based in Massachusetts. They're an awesome organization of landscape architects and designers and farmers. So they helped us kind of envision what the preserve could look like once it opened to the public. Moving left to right across this image, we were talking about outdoor classroom spaces, docks for observation on the ponds, berry patches, ecological corridors, vegetating different parts of the site with perennial and annual crops, accessible walking paths, and then fruit orchards and different kind of experimental crops that the public could enjoy in the space. So from 2018 until the present, the Triangle Land Conservancy continues to work with the Regenerative Design Group with NC Farm Link to connect farmers out to this space who might want to enjoy the property or farm out on this property. And also the Center for Environmental Farming Systems to help kind of study from both an animal science and soil science perspective how these keyline design and silvopasture systems are working. So if you're interested more in this, I encourage you to reach out to the Triangle Land Conservancy. But I'm going to share just a couple of images of this project, which wrapped up this past summer. So Leaf and Limb is kind of the farmer and the brains behind this particular field. So the Triangle Land Conservancy owns the Williamson Preserve and has an amazing conservation easement on the property. And then Leaf and Limb has a long-term user agreement, which means they are the stewards of this particular field and help drive a lot of this design. So this is an image kind of looking across part of this field. As you can see, we have a lot of fescue, a lot of kind of mid-succession privet, crabapple, Bradford pear, a lot of native Chickasaw plum, which is also known as a beach plum, and then a lot of kind of older growth loblolly pine along these old field edges. So when implementing a keyline design system, it's critical to understand kind of what you're starting with, what problems might exist, whether it's Bradford pear that you want removed, or there's runoff occurring on the field, or maybe just wanting to benefit the forage grasses that you have on the site. So in this particular instance, Leaf and Limb is starting a native tree nursery called Project Pando. So the keyline design system was designed for a native tree nursery. And then the idea was that cattle would move through this system in a silvopasture management practice periodically throughout the year. So the image you see here are Hereford cattle that live adjacent to the field. This is Newbold Farm, another partner of TLC out at the property. And for the most part, these pastures are fescue, Bermuda, blackberry, and sweet gum. Very familiar to all of us. So the keyline design system was also meant to kind of improve forage for a lot of these herds that would move through and really benefit the Chickasaw plums, the persimmons, the pawpaws, and other kind of desirable woody species that were kind of existing in these fields but not flourishing. So TLC was able to hire Mark Shepard and his consulting firm, which is called Restoration Agriculture Development, RAD for short. And we spent about a week with Mark Shepard's team, a really long weekend, and then a number of kind of Zoom consults this past March. So this was March of 2021. So TLC, Leaf and Limb, and this RAD team spent many days kind of tromping around in the field, flagging and assessing kind of the water quality issues and runoff issues on the field, and then really mapping heavily for many days kind of what the farm scale approach would be to this field, how we would survey these berms and swales that would be installed, laying out goals and kind of assets of the field, and really coming up with a game plan to how to implement keyline design at this scale. So on the left-hand side, you see Mark and his team kind of analyzing a topographic map, and thinking about how we might move water in different ways. And then on the right is our team kind of listening in as Mark describes some of these water management practices with survey equipment. So for folks that are new to keyline design, survey equipment is really a great tool to purchase or to rent or borrow if you can swing that, to help you make sure that you're designing these berms and swales in an appropriate way. So survey equipment is very fun to use. It's very simple to use. YouTube School is a great way to learn about survey equipment. But this is E.B. Hobbs in the blue shirt and me kind of laying out different berms and swales with Mark Shepard's team, and then also with our TLC team to make sure that we were going to be moving water appropriately across the site. And then once we figured out the keyline pattern, we really started with mowing these pathways. So we wanted to make sure that, on the map, it made sense. With the survey equipment, it made sense. But then once we actually kind of like mowed these trails through the site, that we were reading the topo lines correctly, that we thought that that pattern would work both for livestock and for tree production. And then we thought it would be feasible, again, to kind of dig up these areas. So bush hogging these kind of alleys through the field really was our first step. And then after many weeks of designing and laying out this system, TLC and Leaf and Limb, we were able to hire a local contractor. Both our neighbor helped out with this and Leaf and Limb, to start disturbing very small sections of this field. So the disturbance zones were just the width of a bulldozer blade. So they were 6 feet in width, and they would run kind of very quickly across the field to remove the sod and kind of top layer and start digging these berms and swales. So the image that you see here, you can start to see the keyline pattern. And when I say keyline pattern, what I'm really talking about is, again, this early swath of disturbance with the bulldozer, where it's starting to move across the landscape. And then in the second pass, we were using the bulldozer to throw that loose soil downhill in order to build up that berm. So in thinking about how to build up that berm on your site, a bulldozer might be appropriate, but it is going to be expensive. This was a grant-funded project, so we were able to swing that. But hand tools, again, if you're on a smaller site, is an option. BCS walking tractors are an option. So we'll talk about tools here in a second, but the bulldozer for us was a really great tool. And then a couple of weeks later, we went behind the bulldozer and started seeding in grasses that we wanted to plant across these berms and swales. And in some cases where we had really bad erosion in the past, we also went ahead and put some moldy, spent hay on spots we really wanted to make sure grass germinated. But in general, we just kind of walked along with a chest seeder and a seeder on the bed of the tractor and just knocked this out in about a week. And then the final fun part of this project is that Leaf and Limb and the Triangle Land Conservancy want to make this an open source project so that folks can come out to the Williamson Preserve. They can learn about keyline design from the Leaf and Limb team, and that over time, we're going to start seeing the development of this tree nursery that will hopefully spread native plant material across the triangle to other farmers and other folks in this area. So if you'd like to participate, I should mention, please reach out to both the Triangle Land Conservancy or to Leaf and Limb through their project Pando. They would love to have volunteers and folks who have expertise in this area. So just to kind of wrap up this project, this is an aerial shot of the field that I was just describing. So this is a shot looking north. This is, again, the heart of the Williamson Preserve. So it's a 17-acre field known as the Chickasaw Plum Field. And this was before any keyline design kind of went into the space. And then this was the project after it was completed. So the berms and swales that you start to see here move across the landscape. The Wake County Soil and Water were an incredible resource for us in thinking about this. And of course, Leaf and Limb for stewarding this amazing property. So if you'd like to see this system again in person, you'd be welcome. It's just east of Raleigh, and it's a really, really amazing example of keyline design kind of at that mid-scale farmer level. So we're going to end with talking about one more case study, which is our farm, Panther Creek, which is a larger scale example of kind of a forested tract that is 28 acres in size and really focusing on keyline design in the reverse. So whereas this example with Leaf and Limb and Triangle Land Conservancy is starting with an open pasture and building keyline design and tree canopy into the design, this forested example is starting with a really thick loblolly forest that was unhealthy and overgrown, and we were actually removing trees in order to implement keyline design. So again, our property is 28 acres. This image was taken in 2015, and you can start to see some of these areas of the farm that are just really, really thick. So if you can see my cursor, this section of loblolly pine right near the road was what once existed across the entire farm. So the former owner, before we purchased the property, had not followed a forest management plan, even though they were taxed as forestry. And so we inherited the property, we bought the property but inherited the forest management plan and quickly realized that we did not want to become loggers or enter the timber business in a full-time way. We really wanted to implement agroforestry, mainly through silvopasture. And we also wanted to bring in Keyline design. So we had serious erosion problems on this farm. This property had been in tobacco for a very, very long time. And we had deep, deep erosion gullies across the farm under this tree canopy, which was a real challenge. So the image that you see here is looking across the property after we started doing some logging. So this area that you see in the middle part of the screen is a 2-acre site that we're now growing native trees. And then the images that you see around that, which are kind of these bands of open areas and trees, are where we started implementing Keyline design. And so just a kind of zoomed in version of that same site. Again, here's the 2-acre shrub and tree nursery. This was a couple of years ago, so this image is a little fuzzy. I apologize. But then you can start to see these proposed silvopasture areas of snaking kind of bands of berms and swales mixed in with these stands of trees. Another image of the north end of the farm showing Keyline design. Again, this is a little blurry, so I apologize. This was an area of the farm that we wanted to propose at the time for burning and also for silvopasture. As you can see, kind of our barns and main infrastructure of the farm are close to these areas. So the Keyline design pattern was meant to slow down water, kind of help water these trees that we were starting to establish for silvopasture, but then also act as a fire break. If you're going to be proposing burning of any kind on your property and it's going to be near public infrastructure or your own infrastructure, I would highly recommend looking into Keyline design as an effective fire management practice. In the 1950s, when PA Yeoman developed Keyline design, it was actually started as a forest fire management strategy. As you can imagine, having terraces across your farm that are holding water is really, really helpful in slowing down catastrophic wildfire. So this is a more recent image that you can see here. This was maybe 3 years ago when we started logging more heavily in these alleys and stands. So you can actually see the logging equipment down here in the bottom right. But this image kind of gives you that same view of those patterned kind of rows of trees and shrubs mixed in with the silvopasture alleys. So in the top left, that orange box, we're going to kind of dive into that area in a little bit more detail. That is where a lot of the water is being directed, and then it's feeding these silvopasture systems. So this is after thinning. You can see that the tree stands that remain are about 30 feet wide. A lot of it is very young loblolly, but the Keyline design pattern follows these rows of trees. So we kind of let the trees catch a lot of the water, and then it hits the berms and swales system on the downhill side. So we'll see some photos of that in just a moment. But the idea is that our livestock, which for us is poultry, can move in these grassy alleys kind of between the berms and swales. So when I say we have drainage problems at Panther Creek Farm, this is a great example. We're in a very skinny little section of Durham County that has a soil type that is famous for pottery, but is not a great farm friendly soil if you're growing annual plants. So if you were interested in Durham County and growing vegetables, it's totally doable. There's amazing farmers doing it that are probably here at this conference. But for us, we really were not interested in kind of fighting our native soils. We were interested in kind of leaning into those soil types and seeing what they could do for us. So this particular area of the farm was thick clay. It's very, very acidic. We have a pH of about 4.7. and it holds water for up to a week, which is pretty challenging. So we decided that in order to raise livestock, we wanted to grow a wetland garden that also would grow fodder for goats. So this particular image that you see here is planted with hibiscus, willow, black locust, and elderberry. And we're growing a lot of the willows and the alders and things like that to feed to goats. But then we're really growing out this space so that it can capture this stormwater and then move it into other areas of the farm. So this is the same image that you just saw a couple of years later. We cut this area down to the ground every single year in order for a lot of these areas to coppice. So when I say coppice, I'm talking about cutting a woody plant and letting it re-sprout over and over and over again to produce, again, fodder for livestock, firewood, and different woody crops. So this is what we call a pocket pond in Keyline design. It's an area that's always going to hold water and that can help move water to other areas of your system. So in this case, we're holding water high up in the landscape. So this is one of the highest points of our farm, which for us is 316 feet. And it feeds the berms and swales with overflow water. So these berms are slightly off contour and it feeds water into other areas of the property. This pocket pond in particular acts as habitat, both for birds, amphibians, and insects. When we purchased this farm in 2014, when it was all loblolly, we had a hard time finding any living thing that flourished in a monoculture of pine. So we are now seeing a huge influx of insects and birds and amphibians moving back into this garden. Right after this image was taken that same year, we found our first salamanders on the property. We've seen a black bear on the property. And if people don't believe me that there are black bears in Durham, I'm happy to send you a photo. But we're really, really excited that this infiltration of water and kind of hydrolyzing the area is helping with our wildlife in this area. And then it can also act as seed stock. So if you're somebody that's interested in woody crops or growing things out for nut production, these areas act as a great seed bank. So another example here is a pocket pond within the woods. So this is what kind of a more mature berm and swale can look like, holding water. For us, it provides water to chickens and ducks. It helps slowly water our tree crops and other woodies. It provides kind of a niche ecosystem within a forest, kind of acting like a little like riparian buffer within a tree canopy or within a tree system. And then it also helps reduce runoff, both of compost and nitrogen heavy sources like animal waste. And it also keeps soil from washing into these tree buffers. This is my dad and his dog, by the way. So these are not just random strangers on the farm, but my dad is really out on the property almost 5 days a week, kind of helping manage these systems. And then this is an image of kind of how we can start growing crops in these systems that can benefit our Keyline design pattern. So this is a small kind of berm and swale system where we're practicing different cultivation methods for blackberries. So these are thornless varieties that we're taking cuttings from and we're growing them out on different berms and swales so that our Keyline system is not only holding water, but it's also starting to help produce a yield and a crop. So we are almost at the end of our time. We've got a couple more minutes, and I'm going to share a couple of tools that can help either get you started or kind of launch you into a new kind of phase of Keyline designing on your property. So as I mentioned, I really enjoy kind of the design side of these systems. So some of the tools that I like to recommend if you're just getting started is a really good survey. If you can have a solid survey of your farm, that's kind of the first step. Doesn't need to have every feature kind of mapped out, but you are looking at about $5,000 for a farm of our size just to do a boundary survey. So if that gives folks any idea of kind of a 30-acre property is about $5,000. If you have more to spend on that, I definitely recommend kind of mapping as much as you can, but really you want topo information and your boundary. If you do not have a survey, a topo map is kind of readily available in most counties through public GIS information data. If you have access to that, it's a great resource. Or you can visit your cooperative extension or county soil and water office to get a free topo map of your farm. The other thing I really use often is an engineer scale. So this white ruler that you see on this map is actually not just a typical ruler, but it's what's called an engineer scale, which can really help you kind of make sure you're designing these berms and swales at an appropriate dimension for your farm. And if folks have questions about that, I'm happy to talk further. Trace paper is another great tool. That's the big roll of parchment looking paper you see at the top of this image. Trace paper is designed to roll out on top of a map, but be transparent so that you can kind of sketch out different scenarios for your farm in different iterations. And then any kind of data that you can gather on water, soil types, existing stream buffers and wells are great things to kind of add into Keyline design planning. And then lots and lots of patience. So again, we've been designing our farms, Keyline systems since 2014. We really just are moving into this space where we feel like we can stop designing as much and start kind of implementing some more silvopasture. I also really recommend sketching out these systems kind of in a section view. Section view means just like a pie slice through your system. So kind of looking at a subset of your farm and kind of thinking about how groundwater might infiltrate, how you might increase your riparian buffers with these designs, how you might include funky, seeding areas or gathering areas. Drawing or sketching these out or finding a friend that wants to do that is a great resource. And if you're a more digitally minded person, I should say these are both graphics that I've kind of created, but if you're thinking about designing these things digitally, that's also a great tool. So using things like SketchUp or Photoshop can be really helpful, especially if it's going to be a public site. Thinking about crops can be really helpful in these kind of systems. So this particular view is a urban Keyline system in Raleigh, where we incorporated pawpaws, persimmons, elderberries, blackberries, blueberries, oaks, hickories, and walnuts, along with these berms and swales. But again, visualizing it, whether it's for a grant or it's for your own information, is a really helpful practice. And then finally, thinking about how these systems might function at different points in the year. So, how is your Keyline system going to look or function in the winter versus how is it going to behave in the summer? These are really quick sketches that I did for a property in Raleigh. But for your own farm, it's really helpful to think about how water is going to behave in these different seasons and how it's going to affect your plant cycles. And then for our farm, we're always going between working on the ground, kind of focusing on the systems at hand, and then coming back and drawing or designing those systems further. So I really find it helpful to go between the two. But if that's not something that's comfortable for you, I highly recommend reaching out to somebody who might help with that design process and finding those tools. And then management tools. So there's the design side, and then there's the implementation and management side. So for us, we use a ton of hand tools, both on all of these sites have used hand tools, but on our own farm, we still use them a lot. We also really love our DR brush mower, which is this machine you see on the left. These machines can run over small saplings and really help clear an area for those berms and swales. We also love our BCS walking tractor, which we got from Earth Tools to help us bust up new ground. If you have access to a tractor, we have found that kind of that 30 horsepower, small, compact, four-wheel drive tractor is the way to go to kind of pull swales and berms along. Chainsaws are obviously really helpful in clearing new land, but also a vital tool in the toolbox for agroforesters. And then a subsoiler, if you're not able to purchase something like a yeoman's plow or a Keyline plow of that nature, a simple subsoiler is the way to go. So we got one for $100 off of Craigslist. It does great. It's nothing fancy, but it helps us make those berms and swales. And then one of our main management tools is thinking about animals and moving chickens and ducks through our system. We're adding goats into the mix this coming spring, but animals are a huge help when developing these berms and swales and kind of keeping them maintained over time. So these are some images just of the tools I mentioned. This is a BCS walking tractor that we have that has a flail mower attachment. This is great, especially if you're dealing with a cover crop or something of that nature. Hitting your berms and swales with a flail mower of some kind each spring is really, really helpful to maintaining those. This is the subsoil that I mentioned that we found on Craigslist. We pull it behind a very simple John Deere tractor. So again, nothing fancy, but it helps to rip those swales in new pastures and new areas that we open up. This is the bulldozer that we used for the Triangle Land Conservancy. So this is a 450. The important thing if you're going to use a bulldozer for Keyline design is that it needs to have a 6-way blade. I'm happy to talk more about that if folks have questions, but you do not want to hit it with a straight blade because that's going to cause some problems. So you want the blade to be able to tilt both this way and then forwards and backwards in order to get the correct slope on those berms and swales. But a bulldozer is a must if you're going to kind of do Keyline design. I would say over a couple of acres. It just makes things a lot more efficient. So we completed the 17-acre Keyline system in about 3 days. So it does make really quick work of it. But if you don't have access to this kind of machinery, borrowing something like a tractor and a subsoiler from a friend or another farmer is a great way to go. And then if you really want to get into logging and agroforestry systems, this is my dad in the blue shirt and my Uncle Jay in the green shirt. This is a fella buncher, which is a logging tool to help kind of get machinery into tight spaces on the farm. This giant hook will grab select groups of trees instead of kind of clear cutting areas. But this kind of cleared the path for us to get our berms and swales established. So we were actually paid $6,000 for the lumber that we removed from our property. So it wasn't a ton of money, but we used that $6,000 to help jumpstart the tree nursery and start building these berms and swales. So if you've got timber on your property and you can sell some of that for production, by all means do so, but do it in a sustainably forested way using some of these tools. And then finally, kind of for us, we're moving more into silvopasture at this point. This image is of a friend's farm up in Connecticut, but we're going to be building out these mobile houses over these coming months and bringing in about 900 chickens into our silvopasture system. So if folks have experience and want to talk about silvopasture chicken production, I would love to connect with those folks. I've really gotten a lot of experience on the design side and the forestry side, but this will be the first year that we've kind of taken the silvopasture system to scale. So we recently got a grant from NC Choices, which we're very grateful for, and that's going to help pay for some of these movable housing units. But this is our flock of chickens and ducks. We no longer have this particular flock, but we're going to be doing a mixed kind of free range system for ducks and then mobile housing with our chickens, both layers and broilers in this system going forward. So just to summarize, and we're going to wrap up, Keyline design is, again, a way to lay out a pattern for the farm. And it can lay out for both pastures, woodlands, tree crops, all of these different things, but other activities can then follow along on that pattern. Crops and activities at our farm include blackberries, blueberries, chickens, ducks, and lumber. But it really can be adapted to any system that you currently have. Our system's been maturing since 2014, and we're just now moving into silvopasture at this point. So patience and observation is key. Continuing to watch how water is moving, how your system can adapt is really important. And then be creative as you go along. I think farm books and classes are great, but at the end of the day, you know your land better than anyone else. So if there's a better way to do things, please let me know. We'd love to create a community in Durham, definitely for Keyline design. But please connect with other farmers and practitioners in your area. And then if you'd like to continue the conversation and reach out to me, I've provided my contact information. We do tours at our property quite often, but you do have to schedule them with me directly if that's okay. So my email and my phone number is here. We'd love for folks to come visit us. We do full 2-hour tours with folks that are interested. And we'd love to connect if you're in the area and like to learn more. So thank you all so much for your patience and bearing with us in this virtual format. And again, thank you to Carolina Farm Stewardship for sharing this space with us at Panther Creek Farm. And we hope y'all have a great rest of your conference.